Welcome to Handmade History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Alicia.
And I'm Sonia.
And this week, we're talking about millinery and hat making. But first, this episode is sponsored by Folkwear Patterns. Have you ever wanted to sew clothing that tells a story? For 50 years, Folkwear has been helping makers bring history to life, one stitch at a time. Since 1976, we've been creating high-quality sewing patterns for historic and folk clothing from around the world. From Victorian blouses to traditional Japanese kimonos, from Ukrainian embroidered shirts to 1940s workwear. Whether you're a historical reenactor, a costume enthusiast, or simply love the artistry of traditional clothing, our patterns combine authentic design with modern sizing and clear instructions. As we celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2026, we're honoring 5 decades of helping sewists connect with the past through their craft. Join us this year for sewing contests, new patterns, and more. Visit folkwear.com, that's FOLKWEAR.com, to enjoy our collection and join a community that's been stitching history for half a century. Thank you, Folkwear.
Thank you, Folkwear.
And on another note from me, Alicia, I know that a lot of you listen to this show for a fun escape, and we will be going down a rabbit hole about millinery very soon, but we feel moved to say something about the current events in our country. The detention of immigrants in the U.S. is inhumane and unconscionable. Immigrants are an important part of the stories we tell here about the history of crafts. Immigrants are a vital part of American culture and society. But most importantly, immigrants are people, and no one deserves to live in fear of their lives. As the daughters of an immigrant, this is personal to us. Our father's family left Cuba after our grandfather was detained by the Cuban government, and I never imagined hearing that story as a child that this would ever happen here. But it is happening now, and in fact has happened in my own state. We need to come together as Americans and stand up for those who are in danger of being detained and for those who have already been detained. I encourage you to contact your representatives and ask them to rein in ICE and end the detention of immigrants. If it is safe for you to do so, get involved at the local level to protect people at risk of detainment in your community, and to peacefully protest and resist in whatever way you can. We'll put a link to the two resources to help in the show notes. Thank you for listening and for considering my perspective. Now, let's talk about millinery and hat making. This topic was recommended to us by Laura Ellen. Thank you, Laura Ellen. Sonia, want to kick us off?
So what is millinery? Millinery today means hat making, especially for women. However, in the past, millinery referred to the making and selling of all kinds of accessories for both men and women. This included hats, but could also include cloaks, gloves, muffs, handkerchiefs, and aprons, as well as jewelry. It also historically included accessories for the home, such as table service and clocks. Hat making refers to, of course, the making of any sort of head covering, and we will be talking about the intersecting history of these topics today.
So let's start by talking about the history of hats. Humans have made hats for tens of thousands of years. The oldest extant hat, which we will talk about in a minute, is a 3,000-year-old hat found in Scotland. But evidence exists that humans wove headgear as early as 27,000 years ago. Statues commonly known as Venus figurines show what could be woven hats. Venus figurines are miniature statues that are round, faceless women with exaggerated features, typically naked or wearing a girdle. They are found all over Europe in very old archaeological sites. One famous one is the Venus of Willendorf, which was discovered in Austria. Originally, the heads of these types of figurines were thought to be covered in clay patterns representing woven or braided hair. However, archaeologists discovered impressions of weaving on 90 clay fragments at 2 sites in the Czech Republic, called Dolní Věstonice and Tavlov. These fragments show that humans knew how to weave baskets and thus could also have woven hats. Some of the clay fragments came from homes with clay walls. A person wearing a woven garment sat or leaned on some damp clay, which then dried and was preserved. Other fragments came from clay that was used to line woven baskets. The imprints in all of the fragments reveal complex weaving techniques. So, What early archaeologists assumed was a woven hairstyle might actually be a woven hat. And we'll include a photo of one of these figurines in our blog post.
Next, we will talk about the oldest hat ever discovered. A 10-year-old girl named Babette Mackay discovered the oldest intact hat in a peat bog in Scotland. It is also, according to the National Museum of Scotland, the country's, quote, earliest recognizable garment. Babette was digging peat with her father in 1953 when she pulled out a clump of horsehair. The two of them brought it to a local teacher who gave it to the National Museum of Scotland. Audrey Henschel, the assistant keeper of the museum and a specialist in ancient textiles, first identified it as a hat. The clump of horsehair was actually a spiral, with strands binding coils together. Henschel's analysis, which was confirmed decades later by modern experts, was that the hat was, quote, flat or slightly domed on top with a brim. She noted that another material, which must have dissolved, had been used, because the strands that bound the horsehair were bigger in diameter than the horsehair. The missing material was probably a frame made of straw.
The hat went into storage and was discovered when the museum moved in 2014. Dr. Allison Sheridan, the principal curator of prehistory, radiocarbon dated it to sometime between 1190 and 920 BCE, also known as the Bronze Age. The hat was analyzed again in 2024 with a scanning electron microscope, which confirmed that the hat was made from a horse's tail. The museum began to reconstruct the hat. This was a collaboration between Dr. Susanna Harris of the National Museum and Lilja Husmo, a historical costumer. They both agreed that Audrey Henschel's hypothesis of the straw frame was correct, and they believed that the Bronze Age person who had made this hat used a technique in basketry called wrapped twining.
A side note on terminology in weaving, there are two types of threads, the warp and the weft. The warp threads are the base threads that are put into a frame in one direction. The weft threads are what the weaver moves back and forth in the opposite direction to make the fabric. In basket making, the warp threads are more like a frame, and the basket maker weaves the weft threads around the frame to create the basket. Wrapped twining requires a stiff warp, which here is a frame of straw. Then there are two wefts, one that is stiff and one that is flexible. The stiff weft is held to the warp, and the flexible weft is used to tie the stiff weft around the warp. So to recreate this hat, Harris and Husmo made a stiff warp out of straw, which looks like the skeleton of a flat-topped hat with a brim. Then they made bundles of horsehair. This is the stiff weft. Next, they used 1 to 2 horsehairs as the flexible weft to bind the bundle of horsehair to the straw frame. And it sounds very complicated because it is. Husmo estimated that it would take a skilled artisan 40 hours to make one hat. Each coil of horsehair takes 45 minutes to bind all the way around the hat. A cool detail that the original researcher, Audrey Henschel, noted is that whenever a knot was made to add more horsehair, it was tucked into the inside of the hat to keep it out of sight.
Yes, I love that people were worried about not letting their knots show even in the Bronze Age.
Yeah, to weave in the ends.
Yeah, so human. Hats have been worn across time in pretty much every country. They can be made from a wide variety of materials. For example, hats can be made from straw, palm fronds, fur, leather, banana leaves, and fabrics like wool, silk, and felt. Hats can serve a variety of purposes. They might protect the wearer from sun, rain, or wind. They might serve a ceremonial purpose or reflect the wearer's rank or social status. And hats also reflect fashion. Because of this, there are literally hundreds of types of hats. There are berets, wimples, toques, pitassos, pennons, turbans, chaperones, leghorns, top hats, tam o' shanters, cloches, and so many, many more. And there's a really fun quiz on Encyclopedia Britannica that we will link to in our blog post about women's headgear, and I scored a 10 out of 14. So it was really hard. There are so many hats.
I'm very impressed. I think I could probably recognize like 3 hats.
Every time I would find a new resource about hats, there would be a new type of hat that was mentioned. Today, we are going to focus on the history of hats in the U.S., acknowledging that there is so much more to explore.
So, Native Americans in the U.S. have a variety of traditional hats. Tribes in the Northwest traditionally wore large woven hats to protect themselves from rain. They also showed social status depending on the shape they were woven in or the designs painted on them. The Haida tribe from the Northwest wore tall, wide-brimmed hats made from spruce tree roots. Other tribes in the U.S. wore fur caps. The most well-known native headgear might be the warbonnet, which is a Great Plains Indian tradition. The warbonnet is made from feathers, which are often eagle feathers, but can also come from red-tailed hawks or kestrels. It probably originated with the Osheti-Shakowin people, specifically the Lakota. Other groups that make and wear warbonnets include the Apsaluke, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and Kiowa tribes. The band of the warbonnet is made from animal hide. It can be decorated with porcupine quills or beads, which became popular at the end of the 1800s. There are many different styles of warbonnets. They can stand up straight, go around the wearer's head, and even stretch down the wearer's back to the ground.
Warbonnets represent honor and achievement. They are not worn for fashion. Historically, wearers were given warbonnets and feathers for their warbonnets for achievements in battle. They were and remain ceremonial headgear and are not worn every day, though some people did wear them into battle. Men were the main receivers of warbonnets. Minnie Hollow Wood, a Lakota woman, received a warbonnet at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And this was a battle in 1876 between Lieutenant George Custer's federal troops and North Plains Indians led by Sitting Bull in Montana. And Custer and his men lost this battle, famously. In the 1800s, paintings depicting Plains Indians wearing warbonnets led to other Native people adopting this headgear, and they would wear it really to appeal to tourists. Western movies and TV shows depicting Native Americans also encouraged the spread of this type of dress. And that's how many people in the U.S. came to associate Native Americans with feathered headdresses. However, Plains Indians reclaimed the warbonnet as their cultural heritage, and it remains their own tradition. Today, Plains Indian men and women can receive warbonnets for many kinds of achievements, such as earning a degree.
Another famous American hat is the tricorn hat. These are made out of wool and with a brim that was folded up on 3 sides. A hat with the brim folded up on 2 sides is a bicorn hat. They were popular in England in the 1600s and the 1700s. Originally, the tricorn hat was made to be worn by soldiers in battle, and the folded up sides channeled rain away. They came to the U.S. with European colonists. It was worn mainly by men, but occasionally by women. Another hat from Europe that was popular with colonial women was a hat called the calash. Calash comes from the French word for the extended top of the carriage, the calash. It was a bonnet in the sense of the word we think of today, with a brim that sticks out only in the front. Hat fashion changed frequently and rapidly. Here are a few broad trends in men's hats in the U.S. over the years. The top hat, made of silk, was invented in Florence, Italy around 1760. It arrived in England in 1810, and has widely replaced the tricorn hat in men's attire in the U.S. The bowler or derby hat became popular with men in 1850. It has a more rounded crown and was invented and named after a London hatter. And the cloth cap with a narrow visor became popular with working men and boys toward the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s.
So now we'll return to millinery. Millinery comes from the word milliner, which was first used to refer to a person from Milan, a city in Italy that is famous for its fashion. Later, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, milliner meant, quote, a seller of fancy wares, accessories, and articles of female apparel, especially such as were originally made in Milan, or a person who designs, makes, or sells women's hats. The word milliner first appears in 1530 in a list of Henry VIII's privy purse expenses. He spells it Myllloner. The very first use says, paid to the milliner for certain caps tripped with buttons of gold. It's unclear if these are caps or capes because the word is spelled Cappes. So,
Henry also paid the milliner 52 shillings and 8 pence for, quote, bonnets for the king's grace and the boys of his private chamber. These bonnets are, again according to the Oxford English Dictionary, an old use of the term to mean, quote, a hat or cap of kind traditionally worn by men and boys, especially a soft, round, brimless cap resembling a beret, a tam o' shanter. That famous portrait of Henry VIII by Hans Holbein the Younger shows him wearing a hat like this. The boys in the chamber were the king's group of friends and attendants. Some of them took care of him, and some of them were just influential pals. They were sometimes called the king's minions. There were between 10 and 20 of them at any time.
I did a number of calculations to figure out that the amount Henry paid to the milliner was 2.64 pounds, when the currency was 12 pence to the shilling and 20 shillings to the pound. And 2.64 pounds is about $3.62. Because this is so old, it's really hard to calculate how much that might be today, but it could be somewhere between $150 and $300. So if Henry VIII was shopping for somewhere between 10 and 20 minions, then he bought his hats for somewhere between $7.50 and $30 each. There's a lot of assumptions in there, but it's a big ballpark. The only thing that's really clear to me after this is that British currency makes no sense at all. Some of the other things that Henry bought from the milliner include a knife, a girdle, and 6 pairs of gloves. Many of his other purchases from the milliner are simply labeled stuff or sometimes certain stuff.
So the word millinery became associated with mille, which is Latin for 1,000, in London in the 1600s. Millinery shops in London sold all sorts of accessories for fashion and for homes. As we mentioned at the top of the episode, this can include things like clocks and table service, as well as hats, gloves, and jewelry. These shops might also sell fabric and trims, as well as tools for sewing, like pins and needles. They were a bit like early department stores. When Europeans brought millinery shops to the U.S., they continued to sell a variety of things. However, it seems as though they were limited mostly to accessories for fashion and less of the home goods. These shops still sold finished items, like hats and gloves, alongside fabrics and notions, and even patterns to make your own items. According to one researcher, Janae Whitaker, quote, no exact parameters exist for the millinery business. It could range widely.
And when I think of the word milliner, I think of Felicity Merriman, the American girl who lived in Williamsburg, Virginia during the Revolutionary War. So this led me to look up colonial Williamsburg, which you probably know is a huge living history site with numerous shops, homes, museums, and reenactors. And they had some fantastic resources on their millinery shop, which is staffed by historical reenactors based on real people. These reenactors make and sew things for the rest of the historical reenactors at colonial Williamsburg, while simultaneously educating visitors about what they are making, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a fun place to visit.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at an example of the millinery shops in this one particular place as an example. The town of Williamsburg had only 1,880 residents in 1775, but it had 6 millinery shops in the 1700s. Each of these shops was run by a woman. The one that is recreated in colonial Williamsburg today was owned by Margaret Hunter. Margaret Hunter was a milliner in England who immigrated to the U.S. in 1767. Her sister Jane leased a building in Williamsburg, and the two of them worked together until 1771. Then Margaret started her own shop. She ran it until at least 1780. That's the year of the last advertisement that she ran for her wares. Margaret was never married, and she passed away in 1787.
After splitting off from her sister's shop, Margaret Hunter did not work alone. She owned 6 people, enslaved Black men and women named Aga, Jenny, Millie, Sal, Will Chavers, and several children. These people were skilled in the many skills required of a milliner, such as sewing, laundering, starching, and mending. There were also other journeymen and apprentice milliners who worked for pay or for free as they learned the trade.
It seems like shopping in the millinery store was a social experience. Pastries were often served. Colonial Williamsburg has a great video that compares the experience of talking to the people who made your clothes to the experience of getting your hair done today. The milliner would know your style and help you pick out fabrics and trims. They would help you choose a hat, a pair of gloves, or a kerchief to complete your outfit. These shops carried goods from around the world, including China, Scotland, Holland, and more. The hat fashions were dominated by French and English fashions. People learned about these fashions in newspapers, magazines, and letters from friends. Whitaker, who portrayed Margaret Hunter, said, quote, it was not unheard of for women's hat styles to change 17 times in a year. The most common fabrics used were silk, cotton, linen, and wool.
As the country grew, so did millinery. As a point of reference, there was 1 milliner in the city of Philadelphia in 1800, and 39 in 1820, and 160 in 1850. Both Black and white women became professional milliners in the 1800s. For example, in Philadelphia in 1856, there were 48 Black milliners. By 1900, there were roughly 83,000 women who worked as milliners in the U.S. Based on an estimate of about 5 employees to each shop, that means that roughly 16,000 of these milliners were proprietors of their own shops. During the Victorian era, this was one of the only avenues of business open to and dominated by women. In contrast, the people who supplied these shops, wholesale millinery merchants, were often men. And they had a lot of power over the milliners, including the ability to offer them small or large lines of credit. P.R. Erling, the author of an article called Women in Trade from this time period, said that, quote, women were good credit risks because they neither smoke, drink, play billiards, or do any of the countless things for which men spend. A trade publication kept notes on different milliners, which were read by these wholesalers. And this provides a lot of data on milliners' lives. Most milliners made small profits and had small amounts of capital. They often closed after a few years. The ones that had a piece of land or owned a home already and had more capital to invest lasted longer. There was also commentary in these reports on what the milliners themselves were like. For example, Mehitabel Sampson was described as, quote, disagreeable to deal with. However, she stayed in business for 27 years, which was about 5 times longer than the average milliner. So if people don't like you, don't worry. You might just be a good business person.
By the early 1900s, millinery came to be defined as the design, trade, and manufacture of women's hats. Milliners continued to be mostly women. In contrast, hatters or hat makers made hats for men. The trade again went through another period of change in the early 1900s. Alice P. Barrows wrote an article about the training of millinery workers in 1910. This article was based on interviews with 200 millinery girls working between 1907 and 1909 in New York City. She kicked off her analysis by saying, quote, it is not easy to describe the millinery trade clearly. If the next few paragraphs leave the reader with an impression of chaos, then the description has been successful.
I really felt these words while I was researching this episode.
Yeah. As always, working as a milliner required a diverse skill set. The 4 steps of making a hat included design, making a frame, covering the frame, and trimming. Some of these jobs began to be done by different people. For example, trimmers were skilled in adding trim, like lace, to a hat once it was made. There were also designers, preparers, and copyists. The apprentice model persisted. A girl who wished to become a milliner might take a class and then apprentice herself in a shop. In this case, she might or might not have been paid.
Another article written around the same time noted that, quote, as millinery supplies a necessity of life, it is universal and offers occupation in every community. Every female American required a milliner until about 1960, when both men and women stopped wearing hats. And it's really hard for me to imagine this. One researcher said that a hat was such a necessity that it was almost better to go without shoes than without a hat. Hats were everywhere.
Customers could buy ready-made or homemade hats, trimmed and untrimmed hats, in a variety of settings. Millinery shops might be large and sell hats wholesale to other shops. They might be tiny and create custom-made hats. This was a particularly interesting time to be a milliner, as some parts of the process were beginning to be done by machines. Classes that taught millinery seemed to experience a boom at this time. Colleges offered summer courses in millinery. These were also mixed. Some were intended to teach people how to make their own hats, kind of like an adult enrichment class. Others were intended to train girls to enter the trade. Millinery was a seasonal business, with busy seasons in the fall and spring and dropping off massively after Easter. This was largely a part-time job with long hours in the busy season and unpredictable hours in the slack season. Like many other industries at the time, employers were unregulated and employees were not unionized. A typical millinery employee might work 6 months of the year and earn $5 a week, or about $178 in today's money. She might also work at 3 or 4 different places and have different jobs at each one. Alice Barrows noted that millinery was, quote, an industry in the process of home to factory.
In fact, a committee was formed in New York City in 1936 called the Millinery Stabilization Commission. It was an unofficial advisory board made of workers and employees' organizations. The commission noted that at this time, New York was a large part of the millinery industry. Philadelphia was another important center of millinery and hat making. And we have a few stories from these places during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that we will have to save for another episode, including the story of J.B. Stetson, inventor of the 10-gallon hat, and May Reeves, whose millinery shop is a permanent exhibit in the Smithsonian Museum. But for now, we'll end our introduction to millinery and hats here. Sonia, what do you think?
It was really fun. I need to take the quiz to see how many hats I actually know.
I was disappointed in myself given how many hats I had read about and that I still did not score very well on the quiz, but also there's just a lot of hats.
Yeah. I had the Felicity American Girl.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that. I had Kirsten. I didn't remember that you had Felicity.
And I had I had like a few hats for Felicity. I remember I have one that's like a woven hat for the summer. I was like, They're really fun.
Kirsten had a straw bonnet because she lived on the prairie, and so she had to protect her face from the sun.
This is a fashion hat for sure for Felicity.
Fashion, maybe modesty too,
Yeah.
since everybody wore hats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember going to Colonial Williamsburg when I was a kid, and I was really excited because it felt like Felicity Merriman's home had come to life.
Yeah, it was I mean, I must have been on that trip, but we went. It was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Folkwear for sponsoring this episode. Visit folkwear.com to explore their collection and join a community that's been stitching history for half a century.
Check out our Patreon page and sign up for our free post at patreon.com/handmadehistorypodcast. You can email us at handmadehistoryhosts, HOSTS, @gmail.com, or visit our website at handmadehistorypodcast.com.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Don't you think his accountant was like, Henry, we need some specifics here.
What certain stuff is deductible?